All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to a very special edition of TIA Live today. Today, we're co-hosting and doing this event as a mashup with our friends over at Vietcetera Media. Our topic today is going to be a fun one. We're going to be comparing and contrasting the startup ecosystem of two of Southeast Asia's hottest markets, Indonesia and Vietnam. I called this session a face-off, but obviously we know there's no antagonism between the two countries. As the Southeast Asia pie grows bigger, both countries will obviously have plenty of opportunities to grow, especially in the tech and startup scene. We did pull together this session because we're starting to see the startup ecosystem across the region begin to stabilize, and everyone is starting to make plans around the new reality. So we wanted to talk to the experts today in order to get a sense of how these two promising markets are starting to adjust and manage and set themselves up for the future. So let me please bring our panelists on stage today. We have three of them, and they're all pretty amazing. First up, we have Hao Tran, who will be our Vietnam expert representative, and as well as representing our event collaboration partner tonight. So Hao currently serves as the CEO of Vietcetera, a media platform they co-founded in 2016. He shares trends that are emerging in Vietnam and greater Southeast Asia, and has helped strategize key decisions, including long-term growth, delivery models, and business expansions. Hey, partner.
Hey, Maria, thanks so much. And to the Tech in Asia team for collaborating with us today to make this kind of webinar happen. For me, having been an investor before, I worked at 500 startups, but now I've been working, I founded my startup about 4 years ago now. People always compare Indonesia and Vietnam. I think there's a lot of pros and cons to each one, Indonesia being almost 3 times larger, Vietnam being a bit more homogenous geographically and ethnically and all that kind of stuff. So really excited today to learn from the other panelists, to hear what the market and the ecosystem has to offer.
Thanks, Hao. Looking forward to it. Next, let me bring up Tessa Wijaya. She will be representing the Indonesian perspective today. So Tessa is the COO and co-founder of Zendit, one of the leading payment gateways in Indonesia. She's responsible for overall business operations of the company, and prior to building Zendit, Tessa had a very successful career at various private equity firms for 7 years, so also can speak, I think, to both sides of the founder as well as the investor journey. Welcome, Tessa.
Hi, guys. Thanks.
Hey.
Thanks for the introduction.
Of course. And then last but not least, we have Peter Kemp, who will be our regional expert. So Peter joined Sequoia in 2014 as one of the first members of the firm's Southeast Asia investment team. He's been focused on seed investments as a core member of the search team. He works closely with companies like Zenyum, Kuala, as well as others.
Hey, guys.
Hey. All right. And I'm Maria. I'm the CEO of Tech in Asia, and I will be the moderator today. I'm agnostic, so I take no sides in this face-off. Please note that we do have a Q&A tab on the side of your screen, so you can drop questions anytime, and we have around 10 to 15 minutes set aside at the end of this session to go through all those Q&As. Okay, let's jump in. So I think 2020, it's 2020, we've all talked about it, but I think the main things, and especially on topic for us today, is during the first 7 months of this year, the number of the deals that were announced for Vietnam was around 32 deals, and Indonesia still had 82 deals. And so Indonesia's markets generally look like, people are still signing checks, startups are starting to getting investments. So it brings into a question of, the different funding mindsets between the two countries, and comparing, I think, the two different funding markets. Of course, both what we saw prior to this year, as well as specifically what we've seen this year so far. So Peter, maybe if we can start with you, can you share from your perspective what you guys are seeing between the two different markets, and any sort of funding trends, and any differences specifically between the two?
If you look at a market like Indonesia, right, it's like everyone has been going there for many years because it's the largest domestic market. And when you're an investor and you're trying to build large companies, the first thing you look at is what's the ceiling of a potential of a company, and that's essentially driven by the market size. And I think people started to see that originally in 2004 with the first large investors, 100 million by SoftBank and Sequoia in Tokopedia, that really put like Indonesia on the map in Southeast Asia. And then later, I think in later 2016, if I'm not wrong, 2016, 2017, when it was a bit of a lump in the startup funding scene, and yet this domestic company in Indonesia, Gojek, managed to raise 550 million. That put Indonesia on the global map. So I think that is all well understood. I think what people now start to realize is that it's no longer just like Indonesia domestic or regional where you can build large companies. But if you take a longer view, if you take a 10-year view, then markets like Philippines or Thailand, but specifically Vietnam as well, can actually create very large companies as well. And so there's an increased focus right now in Vietnam, specifically if you combine it with another dynamic, is where in Southeast Asia, most of the initial funding was very much B2C focused, where the growth in the market was driven by consumer spending and the increase in disposable income. Now you start seeing more adoption by micro SMEs, by enterprises even, of technology, and so B2B is growing, but that often requires more engineering skills. And in most markets in Southeast Asia, there's a lack of engineers, and that's where Vietnam, I think, shines with a lot of engineers that originally, like 10 years back, were doing a lot of like quality assurance for and QA for US companies, but now have started to become founders and basically build up the engineering ecosystem. And so that I think is where Vietnam is very strong. Much more other things, but I'm sure we'll touch upon them during the conversation.
Yeah, for sure. So Tessa and Hao, from your perspective, especially within your founder communities, what has this year, I mean, what are people talking about this year, and what are people seeing and feeling with the overall funding environment? And does it feel like investments are shrinking or checks are still moving? What have y'all seen in your individual markets? Hao?
Yeah, I'll start. Yeah, so here in Ho Chi Minh City, that's kind of where a lot of the tech hub of Vietnam is. Hanoi is pretty vibrant itself as well. I think this speaks to the greater region, but there's a lot of dry powder sitting on the sidelines because everyone kind of waited over the last 6 months to see what happens as a result of the pandemic. And I think the investors that were writing checks were giving it to companies that they were already really deep in due diligence with, or were resilient in this new kind of environment. Or they were just trying to bail out companies that they had already invested in and really believed in. So I think that phase hasn't concluded, but it's kind of gone through a next chapter now, and we're starting to see, hopefully going into Q4, Q1 of next year, a lot of these funds they need to deploy. That's how they get their management fees. And here in Vietnam specifically, how it's different from the Indonesian kind of ecosystem is that there were a lot of Indonesian-based and very focused seed investors. East Ventures comes to mind, and there's a number of others. But here in Vietnam, these kind of Vietnam-focused, or at least Vietnam-based venture funds who are in Fund 1, Fund 2, they actually only really started in the last, let's say, 12 months. So they're just getting their feet wet. So you could say it's a bad or good time, but I think now a lot of funds, they're kind of looking around like what's next. So here in Vietnam, at least, I think you'll see going into Q4, new checks are going to be written originating into new companies, and it's already actually happening. For those of you that don't know, Vietcetera, it's a media company. We're a sector agnostic media company in both Vietnamese, primarily Vietnamese and English, but we do cover technology. And there's a number of startups that we're seeing that are raising checks, not huge, not millions and millions of dollars. There's a couple that are kind of in that category, like Tiki and Sendo, which are very large e-commerce companies. Not so much Series A, Series B. Seed still happening into Series A even. And again, it's down to the fact that a lot of these funds were just announced in the last 12 months. I mean, just on top of my head, there's Phoebe Ventures, 500's nearing the end of their first kind of round. There's a new one that just started called Touchstone Partners, ex-Vina Capital partners starting that one. I mean, there's a few others too. Even if they haven't been announced, it's a lot of regional ones from Japan and Korea also coming here, like Access Ventures in Tunisia. So I think the prospect is fairly positive I think
Cool.
at least in terms of deploying funds over the next 3 to 6 months.
Okay, so seed funding is still looking relatively healthy, but that's partially just because these funds just raise money, and so they more or less need to deploy this capital, COVID notwithstanding. Tessa, from the ID perspective, what is the founder community sounding or kind of discussing? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think as with the same, it's the same story as Vietnam in terms of there's a lot of cash out there. A lot of investors are looking to put their money somewhere. But that being said, I think in Indonesia itself, I did see that people were getting a little bit more cautious, especially in the first 6 months. And I think investors are just kind of seeing how the country is going. Obviously, Indonesia's economy contracted by quite a few percent for the first time for a very long time. So I think there's some concern there. But I do think that in the medium, long term, I think Indonesia is still a good bet, right? The demographics are there. We've got a really large consumer base. And I think investors are probably going to start coming back probably by the end of the year or beginning of next year.
Okay, so still fairly conservative with capital deployment. Just generally speaking, any trends that you're seeing in terms of like potentially earlier stage companies getting investments versus later stage, or is it all sort of being held quite tightly right now?
I think in general, it seems like everything is sort of a little bit on freeze. But that being said, look, it's all about your startup, right? I think we're still seeing, for example, even Zenit itself, we're still seeing investors knocking on our door, which is super fantastic. It's again about the fundamentals, about your company itself. Is it, are you in the right spot? Are you seeing what other people are not seeing? And is this something that's going to be super attractive because you've got the right thesis that investors are going to be interested in? So I think for these types of companies where we have that story that investors can understand, I think we can still do quite well even in this market.
Cool. Okay, Peter, back to you. So Sequoia is pretty famous for publishing these like manifestos that kind of summarize the macro environment. And this is kind of my last question that touches specifically on 2020 because I think it's talked to death, to be honest. But internally for y'all, did you have a sense of pulling back or leaving some of your capital as dry powder? And as we're moving into the Q4 of 2020 and looking forward to 2021, has the mindset for investment kind of shifted at all?
Let me see what I can. Yeah, I know this is public information. Okay. No, so I think what's interesting is that a few things happened for us during COVID. Like there was a manifesto indeed that Sequoia was one of the first to call out the Black Swan event and what that meant and guidelines for companies and urging folks to really step back and reevaluate every core assumption of what they were building. That got a lot of adoption and questions, and people started leveraging that. And it basically meant a lot of really hard work and tough work during COVID in terms of companies indeed reevaluating and streamlining and redundancies, etc. And many companies that were heavily impacted. So whilst that was going on, we were actually still investing full on. And we obviously have a pretty long history within Sequoia, and some of the best companies that we've invested in were around 2000 and the .com. If you think about the previous crisis, we had Stripe and Dropbox and Airbnb, and just a couple of like amazing companies that were invested in exactly during that period. So we have gone full on that, and even raised, I think globally during COVID on Zoom, 7 billion plus of capital for the various funds in US and China and India, Southeast Asia. So raised two funds, 1.35 billion in total, venture and growth for India and Southeast Asia. So all of that happened in the last 3-4 months. So no pulling back whatsoever, frankly.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
actually, maybe sorry, just maybe one thing I forgot is what you actually start seeing and why sometimes strong companies get formed during these crises is also because a lot of folks, the opportunity cost of other jobs, are less. There's fewer people hiring, there's redundancies. these folks, like, they'll try their luck, right? And they start companies. So there's a higher degree of risk taking in the founder community, and employees turning founder, and that's actually a great time to actually invest.
Yeah, definitely. That's a theme I've heard several times. So I think you touched upon this earlier, but there are some like vertical specific leanings, I think, between the Indonesia market as well as the Vietnamese market. And so to a beginner who's just starting to dip their toe and cross compare, like to a beginner investor rather, who's trying to cross compare between the two different markets, can you, I mean, maybe to everybody on this one, but where is each market particularly strong, right? Whether it's like that B2C, the engineering side, like what kind of specific sectors or types of businesses is each market particularly strong in? How in Vietnam, what do you think?
Well, I think in Vietnam, it's part of our mission too here at Vietcetera. We want to share Vietnam to the world. I think at least in the English content, there's just not a lot of awareness about what this country is, and you can say the same for Indonesia. But being a journalist myself, I can't quote my sources, but I can tell you now that there's some interesting facts. Like in Vietnam, it's actually the #1 market for certain goods, like iPhones, according to our sources. It's actually larger than Indonesia and even Singapore, despite there not being a presence and footprint of Apple stores in Vietnam. And even other more products, like I talked to the CEO of Piaggio Asia, which is based here in Hanoi in Vietnam. He said that Vietnam is the largest seller of Vespas in all of Southeast Asia. And that's with it being 1/3 of the size of Indonesia and 10% of the per capita GDP of a place like Singapore or Malaysia. So I think here in Vietnam, not a lot of people know that the appetite for kind of consumption is not only has historically been strong, but there's a lot of signals that point towards even greater consumption. But if you also look at the history of the country, even the present as well, it's always been more international and forward-looking, a little bit more progressive. And some examples include, if you look at education here in Vietnam, it's the #1 spender per capita on education in Southeast Asia. And it's actually the #1 source of students going to countries like the US, the UK, and Australia, again, despite having a much lower per capita GDP, a much lower population even. And I think, I don't have the exact numbers on me, but I know it's a fact that I think it's more than double, like even the nearest second place kind of source of international students going abroad. So I think those are just like high level numbers. And, this applies both pre and post COVID. I mean, here, even in Vietnam, for those of you that don't know, there was a period of 100 days from I think April or something, that there was no COVID cases in the country. And that speaks a lot to how the country has been able to manage and kind of, it's really concerned about societal kind of welfare and social order. That streak was unfortunately broken recently, but it's still very single digits even. Like here in Vietnam, I can go outside, I can go eat lunch. I don't have to worry about things. People really take COVID seriously. And that's a reflection, I think, of the country as well. It's very collective. There's this idea of collectivism in this country that I really appreciate. As an American, we're known for being individualists and isolationists. And it's very different coming to Vietnam, where it's just a different kind of mindset. So I think it's almost like a herd mentality. I don't know if that's a good or bad thing, but when people see things happening, they kind of drift towards that direction. And trends and even conspicuous consumption is in the same way. That's why things in Vietnam can take off very quickly, even if they're either Vietnamese brands or companies or ideas or international ones. Hopefully that answers the question. Sorry, I just kind of ranted a little bit.
Well, I mean, let me bring you back a little bit. So I think specifically like markets, it sounds like, or sectors that you're keeping an eye on is definitely, I think, the education spending, which means that there might be opportunity for ed tech companies in Vietnam potentially, as well as consumer electronics.
Yeah, I mean, anything that touches kind of middle income or above kind of spending, I think it's still very, very resilient, kind of white collar spending.
Okay.
On face value, you might not think there's a lot of white collar consumers here, but it's actually quite significant. I mean, I don't know how accurate these economic data here are in Vietnam, but if you live here, it's there's just so many amenities available to you. as an everyday consumer, a new brand starting. I think the only negative, I mean, so Vietnam, for instance, we were just saying, Tessa said earlier, Indonesia contracted in the last quarter. Vietnam actually grew. And actually grew, I think, 2.6% or something. Who knows if those statistics are accurate, but at least that's a positive sign on face value. The only markets that have suffered tremendously are low value added manufacturing. So we're talking like garments. I think in the West, there's, prices are going up for labor, but prices for the consumer side are going down. So there's a squeeze where how are factories in Vietnam supposed to survive on these kind of really thin margins? We're talking like sub 5% for low value added manufacturing. And so we're seeing a pretty devastated industry actually in relation to that. But high value added manufacturing has actually increased. So Apple, for instance, they're now apparently building the majority of their AirPod Pros here in Vietnam. And they're seeking, if you go to LinkedIn and stuff there, you can see Apple's hiring like 1 million people based in Vietnam, supply chain managers, everything to marketing managers. They have an office here in Saigon that's in the nicest grade A office tower. They have a whole floor. This was 2 years ago, an entire floor. I think it's like 3,000 square meters for like 6 people. I've been there once. It was pretty remarkable. But that tells you a lot about the kind of brands still investing here. And in general too, I still do go to China quite a bit, and you walk around one of the boulevards in like Shanghai and Beijing, you see all these international brands. I think here in Vietnam, probably 10% of those brands that are currently in China are currently operating here in Vietnam or even being distributed. And what does that tell you about the market size? It means that, or potential, that means there's still 90% of a total addressable market, at least in terms of brands that have yet to enter the country. The next 10 years is going to be rocking. I think there's going to be so many brands coming in. And as long as these, again, more middle income and higher kind of consumer base is growing, these brands will see that. And it's one of the last markets in the world really that has that, so far has escaped that middle income trap.
So I think in reality, Indonesia's startup ecosystem is definitely several years ahead of that of Vietnam's. And Peter, I mean, just kind of curious to hear from your perspective. Oh, and Tessa's back. Thanks. But I guess from your perspective, it's Indonesia started to move forward, and I think tech has moved out and broken across multiple different sectors now. So what are the ones that you think are still offer relatively untapped opportunity, and are still like in a major growth phase? Tessa, maybe if we can start with you.
Sure. So let me just repeat the question. Sorry, because I dropped off really quickly. It sounds like interesting spaces within tech that's growing in Indonesia.
Yeah, specific sectors and business models, I guess.
Definitely. I mean, I'm very bullish on fintech in general. That's why I'm here. But I do think that that's kind of still in exploratory mode. We had an influx of all these P2P lenders in the past few years. That's been the boom in the fintech industry. I think there's still a lot of opportunities as well if people are, for people who are here on, InsurTech and all the likes of that. So I think that's one industry I think is to watch. No one's also been able to crack really in Indonesia the fact that there's a bunch of something like 40% of Indonesians are unbanked. So I think fintech is definitely still the way to go. I mean, another sector that's interesting also is, health tech, edutech. Everyone seems to be kind of getting in that direction. And COVID certainly kind of speeding things up from that perspective. So I think definitely the way to go. And also the last thing I think is even e-commerce, I think is still, a lot of people say, hey, we're 10 years behind on e-commerce than the likes of the US. I am a big believer of that as well. We've got, Tokopedia who's done really, really amazing, but we're seeing even through this year, a lot more different kinds of, I think I still label it as e-commerce, where deliveries, selling even fresh goods online. I think there's certainly ample opportunities there for people to get into.
Yeah, like the e-commerce enablers, if you will.
Right.
Yeah. Peter, what about you? I mean, when you invest in both, do you kind of have a sector leaning between the two countries, or is it just based on the individual company?
No, listen, it is somewhat opportunistic. Both represent opportunities, and again, in Indonesia, it's a bit easier to look at purely domestic plays. Like when Sequoia invested early in Tokopedia, like we'd obviously seen thematically that every large market in the world creates one or two very large horizontal e-commerce platforms. You had Amazon and eBay, you had Alibaba and JD, you had Flipkart, and back then Snapdeal in India. And so it was very logical to back that thesis. And obviously in Vietnam, you had Tiki and Sendo. And so I think one of the things that is changing, though, and that's interesting, and Tessa just mentioned e-commerce, and yes, there's still all sorts of opportunities, and we've looked into, and we've actually invested behind several D2C brands, so direct to consumer, and a couple of other players. The only thing that is interesting, and it has frankly nothing to do with Vietnam or Indonesia specifically, but between 2019 and 2020, a lot of things have happened that had little to do with COVID. If you think about what happened last year with WeWork and the challenges of Uber and the IPO of Peloton and a couple of other companies that were trading at like technology and SaaS multiples, but didn't have the gross margins that come with that, and had a lot more, atoms versus bits, as we often say. They've not trended well, and it has caused this shift from being focused on just growth at all costs, where unit economics take a backseat, to much more focus on the fundamentals of a company and the economics of a company. And so sometimes we see really interesting companies, but like the running joke is like, oh, that's a 2019 company. What does that mean? It's a company where the unit economics are not very healthy, right? And sure, like always in the early days, they're not perfect, and a lot will need to happen. But I think that's one of the things that's changing. That to some extent is seeing a shift or a change in allocation, even in the public markets, from those types of businesses to software as a service, where normally gross margins are really high. So you see SaaS currently trading like exceptionally high from multiples on forward revenue. Sequoia was lucky to invest fairly early in Zoom. You've seen where that's going. And so that is one thing that is happening a lot. And specifically bringing it back to Southeast Asia, we're gradually seeing more adoption of enterprises of SaaS companies and of technology here. Like 3 years ago, that was all very novel. When salaries are low, it's easier to throw people at a problem rather than technology. That is starting to change. But also, and specifically in countries like Vietnam and Indonesia, the rise of smartphone adoption, and the fact that now a small little pharmacy in Vietnam or a warung in Indonesia, those owners have become somewhat technology savvy, and that's driving this massive mobile SaaS and micro SME SaaS type dynamic. So with Surge, we invested in Bukukas in Indonesia that focuses on the warungs. In Vietnam, with Surge, there's an investment in Proxy, which is basically like B2B from pharmaceutical distributors to pharmacies, and we're seeing a big uptick in that segment as well, and we'll continue to look into that. Yeah.
So earlier you mentioned that Vietnam is exceptionally strong in terms of engineering talent. Does that then translate a little bit to this SaaS trend, which is that Vietnam is more likely to field great SaaS companies because of the core engineering strength, like I guess in comparison to Indonesia, but also in general, or do you kind of separate those two?
No, there is a bit of a correlation. I'm just thinking, I think all the investments that Sequoia and Surge have done in Vietnam are not B2C companies. Tilio, which actually sits in that category as well, is B2B. Earlier, we backed with Sequoia an investment in Trusting Social, which was backed by 500 startups as well in the early days, which is also B2B. Search invested in Uiza, which is a video streaming platform, which is B2B. Now, maybe that's coincidental, but there's definitely somewhat of a correlation between that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Vietnam, correlation, not causation or anything, but Vietnam tends to have potentially more investable B2B companies in your perspective, whereas Indonesia is much more of a B2C play.
Frankly, I wouldn't put it as black and white.
It doesn't feel right.
because in Indonesia, there's clearly both, right? There is, again, I mentioned Bukukas as an example, and there's other, with Sequoia, we'd invested in Mokapos, which is a mobile SaaS POS that again focus on merchants, so was B2B. So you see both of them, but there could be some level of skewed because of a startup and a good viable idea is not just driven by demand; it's also supply of the founders and the supply of the engineering teams, etc. So I think, but how keen to get your thoughts on that, because you're obviously in the market and you're seeing that.
I was about to say, so I think historically in Vietnam, so my co-founder is actually, he founded one of the largest outsourcing companies that he's no longer part of. It's called Pyramid Consulting back in 1999. At the time, it was in the only tower in all of Vietnam that had dial-up internet. And he said, and this kind of reflects the ecosystem, not now, but back then, that Vietnam used to be an outsourcing country where you had product managers from the US, from Japan, from Korea, from Singapore coming to Vietnam, building engineering teams. And so the engineering here has a lot of hard skills, but what I find is that there's not a lot of product thinking people, like generally speaking, because you used to always have foreigners coming here, leveraging the hard skill talent to code, but not build products for Vietnamese people. And so when I talk to like HR directors at companies like Shopee and Tiki and Sendo, they're always saying how it's so hard to hire product managers, but it's really easy to hire engineers. Now, when I say easy, I don't mean by just being they're easy to hire. They're just available, but they're getting more expensive. I will say that in terms of just salaries and wages. And regarding Peter and your guys' comments about B2B, B2C, all that kind of stuff, I think B2C, why Sequoia perhaps hasn't invested in Vietnam is just because, at least on paper, Indonesia is 3 times bigger. I actually pitched to Peter like a year and a half ago. I remember this is when our first ever investor pitch, and we just went to Surge because we just applied and got to the final round. And the comment from Peter was actually that, at least on face value, it's 1/3 of the size of Indonesia. So in regards to a total addressable market for a B2C company, there's just not enough people to warrant a unicorn company, let's say. Now, to refute that, I think I don't disagree with that paper or statistic, but if you look at the consumption patterns of Vietnamese people, going back to my earlier comment about education, about middle income spending, about consumerism, it's just more heightened than a place like Indonesia, I feel like. Mostly because of its reception to internationalization. There's a saying even in Saigon that Hanoi people save, Saigon spend. Like a lot of my staff, I mean, some of them buy like iPhones and laptops like mad, and I know what their salaries are. It's like 3 times their monthly salary. I don't know what that you're seeing that in Indonesia, but it's just remarkable. Even going to so recently there's a Singaporean snack called Irvin's. It just came to Vietnam. It's being distributed by one of our clients, and it's pretty expensive. I mean, to buy like 100-gram bag, it was like 100,000, which is like $5. And I brought a bag to the staff, and they just all ate it up in like one team meeting. And some of them told me later they just bought it, which I'm thinking in my head, that's like a day or 2 of your salary, but it just really demonstrates the appetite for spending. Now, in regards to B2B, I think, I don't think it's more of like just it happens to be like that, or maybe the market's better for that. I think, again, going back to the history of Vietnam, it's been an engineering hub. And it's easier to develop B2B products because it requires so much more engineering resources, generally speaking, than a B2C company. Right. And I would also say, if you look at a lot of Indonesian companies like Grab, let's say as an example, their major R&D center is in Vietnam. I think they expanded to like Seattle and India as well, but the engineering hub here is massive. And it's also their second largest consumer kind of market. They're really focused on here. Gojek just expanded here. Gojek doesn't have R&D in Vietnam, but they've spending a ton of money on consumer acquisition. And I think it's going to change. I mean, Vietnam, again, not a lot of product managers in the past, and that's why there's been a lag time compared to, say, in Indonesia. But it's also attributed to the fact that a lot of Vietnamese people, if given the opportunity to study abroad, they kind of stay abroad as well. So you have a lot of really talented Vietnamese nationals who work at companies like Amazon, at Facebook, at Uber, at multiples larger than any other Southeast Asian country. But now they are coming back because in Vietnam, you have amenities, you have salaries, you have opportunity that matches their ambition. Mm-hmm. And that's what a lot of people don't see because they either don't live here or there's just not a lot of content about that. But that story exists. Whereas Indonesia, I think it got a head start. Well, there's just so many more people, but also Indonesian people are less likely to study abroad, just at least numerically. And so maybe at least at the founding level, at the product level, they're really thinking about their country rather than, oh, I got a 6-figure job at Facebook, I'll just go work over there and never come back to Vietnam. Yes, it's changing now, but Indonesia, yeah, it's 5 years ahead for a lot of different reasons. But I think if investors or even brands are looking for another market to get their feet wet, now is the time for Vietnam, because all the fundamentals are there. And as long as the GDP growth is growing, I think the consumer white collar class is going to be outspending all other Southeast Asian markets.
Okay, so a strong repatriation market and trend, and although a smaller TAM, actually potentially the consumer spending habits may, I don't know, offset some of that. Sounds like you were working on that rebuttal for 1.5 years to Peter, just FYI. So I'm glad we gave you an opportunity to deliver
I've articulated it a lot because investors like Sequoia, and it totally makes sense. I agree too. It's, you look on the paper, it's a third of the size.
Yeah.
But why do investors invest in markets like, I don't know, Japan or Korea versus China? Or, you know, you compare the US to China or all these different other markets. I think every market has its own kind of value. But if you look at Southeast Asia, which a lot of funds by their investment thesis are so focused here, like Vietnam has a lot going for it. And I'm not saying it's like we have to pick one or the other. I think Vietnam has just historically been undervalued for a lot of reasons, including there's not a lot of content about Vietnam. Repatriation numbers are very low historically. Like I came to Vietnam 4 years ago. I'm Vietnamese American. And so I graduated from university in 2014. I think there were like 10 other Vietnamese people at my university, nationals, not Vietnamese American like myself, Vietnamese nationals. And one of them is in Vietnam. The other 9 are like living in New York or London or whatever. You fast forward to 2020, it's like 8 out of 10 are in Vietnam. And that's because the quality of life here is just so much better. You have access to so many things, but also salaries are just higher.
Yeah,
so
definitely.
And I think you've seen the same dynamic with Indonesia, and you've seen the same dynamic with India. And I think frankly, how a lot of the things you say make sense, and they're to some extent true for Philippines as well, and for Thailand as well, which are all growing markets of somewhat similar size in GDP, etc. And if you think about those three, I think Vietnam is now getting the most interest out of those three, at least in the investment ecosystem. Like it's like Indonesia for sure will focus there, but what's next? It's more Vietnam than some of the others. Several of the things you just mentioned, I felt about Thailand, I felt about Philippines, and I think what is starting to happen, and actually indeed in the last year or so, even ourselves have started to look different, realizing that if you take a 10-year view, Vietnam, Philippines, Thailand, etc., will be similar to whatever Indonesia has now, not because of the number of people, but because of the growth in GDP per capita, right? And so if you look at a search investment like Tilio, which is a domestic investment, you know, there is the belief that a company like that can become, you know, extremely large. And obviously, again, back to the B2C part, even a Tiki and a Sendo are already very highly valued and will grow much further, even, no doubt about that. So I think there is clarity about that potential of the market, for sure.
Tessa, if I can bring you back into the conversation a bit. So I think we've talked a little bit about like some of the specific market characteristics of both the tech talent within Vietnam, as well as some of the founders at this point. I know it's hard because Indonesia is like obviously such a diverse and large market, but can you kind of summarize, I guess, from your perspective, like how you see this overall tech talent, any trends specifically that, you know, that the TIA audience would be interested in?
So I think, yeah, there's some agreement there in that, look, compared to the Vietnamese, we probably don't have such strong engineering tech behind us. I mean, to be clear, or to be frank, you know, when I first started out in private equity, maybe losing count on the math, but like maybe 12 years ago, there were hardly any startups here. Maybe there was Tokopedia and a few e-commerce, but there was no fintech. Really, when Zendet started, when we started our payment gateway in 2016 in Indonesia, that was where the rise of fintech was. So it is very early days. People are just getting to know what a startup is outside of e-commerce, selling goods online. So I think in that respect, we are definitely needing to catch up, and the government really needs to do something about education in order to get better tech talent in here. But in terms of the founders itself, I think Same with what's happening in Vietnam and Indonesia. There are a lot of returnees, people looking to take advantage of the market, looking at the demographics of Indonesia. One of our investors call us sea turtles, which is Southeast Asia returnees, right? And that's very much true. I think I'd have to agree that, when I first came back, there was a trickle of Indonesians from overseas. But now I'm seeing a lot more talent coming in, people coming in to join Zendit, and also obviously to start their own startups. So I think in terms of founder talent, there's a lot out there. Obviously, there's also a lot of homegrown talent that's not been out and overseas, right? Not all co-founders or founders in Indonesia were educated in America or elsewhere. I think there are some that are completely homegrown, grew up and started working here. But I think, so in terms of founding talent on the business side, I think there are plenty here. We're very entrepreneurial as a nation, I think. In terms of on the tech side, I think that's where the struggle is at, right? Even for things like finding like the likes of product managers, even that term like product management, that's only come in so recently, right? So I think that's where we need to catch up.
So, as a founder, and obviously y'all run a very successful and awesome payment gateway system, like tech is the backbone of what you do. So where do you go looking for tech talent at this point? Are you looking internally? Or are you kind of trying to bring people up, like getting fresh grads out of university? Like what are your coping strategies here?
Yeah, sure. So I think Zendit has this really weird DNA. When we started out, we were really the underdogs. So how we started was we hired a bunch of friends from ITB. They all came in to join us. They were like, what is a fintech startup? And we somehow coaxed them in. And we grew our business from there with these fresh bloods who we trained from the ground. I think that DNA is stuck with us. So even throughout our engineering talent, a lot of the junior guys are still continuing to come in, and we continue to welcome them because, we support talent, we support that growth here in country. But in terms of things that are a little bit more complex, data engineering and all the likes of that, we are having to, cast the net wider. We are lucky that even though we're in B2B, we're less glamorous, we're less known perhaps by the public, we've been able to attract global talent to come and join us. So I think certainly I'm seeing that change because we're no longer as early stages as we were before.
Okay. And the last question I'll ask before we kind of go over to the Q&A box, which I see there are a lot of, is I think this like perennial Southeast Asia question, which is, becoming the top player in your field within your own country versus like becoming kind of a regional giant. And then specifically like Indonesia has had some companies that have, gone regionally quite successfully. I think Vietnam has yet to really have like a strong regional contender. And so what are the kind of the challenges for like local startups, in your opinion, within your markets, local startups competing with like these well-funded regional giants? Is it something that founders are looking to do? Like, not only will I win the Vietnam market, but I'm also going to win the Southeast Asian market? Or do you think like the mindset is a little bit different and just like focusing on winning your home turf? I guess for Indonesian founders, Vietnamese founders, and then Peter, maybe what you've seen recently. Yeah, go ahead, Hao.
Yeah, so I think I had this conversation with this founder from an influencer marketing platform called Hip the other day, and he's already in Indonesia, he's in Thailand as well, and looking at Philippines and Malaysia, but they're fairly small companies. So I think their regional headcount's like 60, 70 people. And I was asking him, like, why are you expanding so quickly when you haven't even won Vietnam yet? I think his mind share is fairly up there, but as a percentage of, they're not even $1 million business in Vietnam yet. So right. Like expanding so outside so quickly, you add a lot of overhead so quick and whatnot. But if you look at the most, I guess, not only well-funded, but most successful companies here in Vietnam that are venture-backed, you think of Momo, which is an fintech e-wallet company. They have a couple million active, I think, daily or monthly users here in Vietnam. And yet there's only, there's 50 million cell phone users in Vietnam. So they haven't even cracked 10%. So I think the mentality here, at least, is to own the home market before going outside, and that's shown through just empirical like evidence. But I think a lot of startups are beginning to think of it. But I would say one of the largest kind of things blocking them is also the idea that Vietnamese people just aren't really used to going out. They might be receptive to international ideas, but in terms of expanding their businesses outside, they're more of an export business than actually going there and setting up an office and hiring people and whatnot. You lose all your advantages that you had here by going elsewhere. And I think a lot of companies just aren't well funded enough, or they just don't have enough leadership or exposure to a regional audience to hire those kind of people. And I think it's about the brand of Vietnam. It's just not really at a international level perceived as like a place that can export ideas or brands or whatnot. But that steady modernization of Vietnamese brands is approaching a point where we can see more of that happening.
Okay. Sorry, let me just keep moving because we only have a few minutes left. Tessa, from your perspective, Indonesia obviously is a bit of an exception in this one.
Right. Look, I think, to be frank, when I was also an investor, regional play is always really sexy, right? It's a great pitch. Like you're taking over the market, Southeast Asia or wherever else, right? But the reality is this, right? We started out here homegrown in a very challenging environment, right? Payment systems were very unique to Indonesia. Everything was very specific to Indonesia, including regulations, right? So even for the likes of us as a startup to think about, okay, let's now think about going to a more developed market like Singapore, or a developing market like the Philippines, Vietnam, or Malaysia, those profiles are so different. And these countries, especially the emerging side, the non-developed side, right? Especially in payments, outside of, for example, Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia, it's so specific and it's so opaque, right, from a regulatory perspective, that I think in practice, it would be like starting a whole other setup all over again. So I think I'd have to argue that even for those who have expanded regionally, the likes of Gojek and Grab, it's yet to be seen who is going to be successful. That's my opinion. And I think because it's hard as a founder, trying to figure out and trying to navigate a whole other country, a whole other system is a huge challenge in itself, and it's a huge risk.
Peter, what do you say to your portfolio companies that come to you and are like, I want to go regional?
Yeah, it's obviously a conversation we have a lot, and it depends on a lot of different things, right? And obviously it depends about how much potential, and back to what House said, like if you go too early when you haven't captured sufficient market yet in your home market, and you haven't nailed down your business model, you basically might make a mistake in your home market, and you replicate that in 5 other markets, right? And that's a costly mistake to make, and it has happened, right? So thinking through, like, is your customer acquisition engine humming? Is your economic engine humming? Is your domestic market starting to saturate? Or is there a competitive threat in others where you have to basically play land grab? These are all like strategic considerations that you have to take into account. And sometimes we say like, hey, go out early and immediately become a regional player. And sometimes we say, hey, like just really focus on winning that domestic market, and then at some stage we'll see whether we go into another markets. Like I serve on the board of funding societies, Modalku in Indonesia and in Malaysia. They're in 3 markets, and they were the first to be kind of like a regional player being in these 3 markets. And then afterwards, we started becoming more discerning, and we said, listen, like what's the value add of going to another market?
Basically, multiple strategic considerations, and it depends on the stage of where you are and some of the things I just mentioned. There's no cookie cutter approach, frankly.
Yeah, for sure. And I think as everybody said, actually, going too early can be kind of a death blow because it's obviously such a costly and expensive and time-consuming move to make. Okay, so let's go to Q&A. We have a bunch. Before we do, I just want to give out a quick shout out for our Startup Arena pitch battle that Sequoia, Peter's team, and I are at TIA working on. It's going to be Southeast Asia's largest pitch battle. We have 4 regional semifinals this year, 1 each for Singapore, Vietnam, and Indonesia, very relevant to today's discussion, and then 1 for the rest of Southeast Asia. So then the winners of these semifinals will advance to our final pitch battle at this year's TIA conference in October. We have up to $30,000 USD in cash prizes on the line, so I would highly encourage, and of course you get yourself in front of VCs such as Peter and the rest of the Sequoia team. So anybody with an early stage startup idea should definitely apply. All right, let's go to the most upvoted questions. For the panelists, what are some of the key factors that are still missing in Vietnam and Indonesia to enhance the startup ecosystem? I'm going to give each one of y'all, like, what is the one thing that you think each market is still missing or the biggest challenge that you're facing right now? Tessa?
Yeah, so I'll take this one so that I can have the first answer. I think definitely what we've been talking about, HR, human capital, right? That's still a struggle, trying to figure out how to hire in country, how to hire the right people to get your company up and running. And that's why now we've had to cast a net and hire regionally for a certain position, just because I think in Indonesia, the startup scene is still very, very much early stage, in my opinion anyway.
Okay. How in Vietnam?
I would say it's a branding issue. Vietnam hasn't really had the kind of appeal on an international level for investors. That's changing. I think a lot of PE firms, not just outside of tech as well, are beginning to really look at Vietnam. And that branding has to do with a lot of issues related to like corporate governance, to legal matters, to even the people even. But yeah, I would say it's a branding kind of issue in Vietnam at the moment.
Okay. Peter, you can answer for both or for one.
Yeah, sure. In Indonesia, it continues to be talent. There is a way around it, but we'd love to see more of it. In Vietnam, actually, maybe let me mention two things. One is, and again, it's not always needed domestically. More and more opportunities are there. But sometimes for businesses that want to go international, sometimes culturally and language-wise, etc., sometimes founders that haven't had the international exposure are too focused inward. Like how won't see that you have international exposure or you're even American-born. You see the same thing, by the way, in China, but there it's not an issue because that market is so huge. And sometimes you see companies that want to get out and don't. And we've seen that also in Thailand and some other markets. So that's one. And then second, is more broadly Southeast Asia, but I'm seeing it in Vietnam as well, just professionalizing, like the angel ecosystem, the governance of companies, the financials, how they manage that, a deeper understanding of like really simple accounting things where we've seen some surprises here and there. So just educating the ecosystem on some business and accounting fundamentals, it would be good.
Fair enough. Okay, next up from Michael Feldman. Is there any concern that in these two countries, there's not much tech innovation or IP? It's mostly, or your moat is mostly based on speed and capital?
I'm going to take that one first, I guess.
Go for it.
If that's okay. I actually think a lot of innovation are coming, especially in payments, right? Coming from Southeast Asia. I mean, in Indonesia, I think we need to push even more, because right now we haven't been able to solve that problem of, that unbanked. But I don't think it's just a race about speed and capital. I think definitely there are a lot of unique ideas coming up from Southeast Asia. That's my view.
Okay.
Yeah, I actually don't like this question because it's making an assumption that's not true.
I agree. It's a bit of a loaded question. Yep.
Like I don't know what kind of perspective this person's asking from, but I completely disagree. I think, well, first off, the moat is not even speed and capital. That's not the moat in Southeast Asia. Maybe speed is, but that's a generalization. Capital is definitely not a moat. Maybe Indonesia, maybe, but even in Vietnam, it's definitely not. And that would apply for the rest of Southeast Asia as well. So this question's inherently wrong, actually.
Great. We will move on immediately. From Nim, within the next 5 to 10 years, do you think Vietnam will overtake markets such as, this is a big question too, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand? I'm going to assume Malaysia, or that could be Myanmar, but I'm going to assume Malaysia.
Who is this for? Sorry?
This is for Peter and Hao.
Peter, go first.
Sorry, what is, let me see, within the next, we see Vietnam overtaking markets, not overtaking Indonesia, but definitely growing very rapidly. There's a lot of interest now. You see strong companies going out. Success breeds success, right? And one big company, founders, like it creates other founders. If you look at the number of like I'm not necessarily a fan of Rocket Internet, but a lot of the employees there have learned how to grow fast, focus on customer acquisition, work under pressure. They go out and launch companies, and we've invested in several founders that have worked there, and it's actually been good. You now see folks coming out of Gojek, coming out of Tokopedia in Indonesia or regionally, and that'll start happening in Vietnam as well. And you see the returnees that play a very big role. We've seen that in India as well, where many of the big companies have folks that have actually worked for like high velocity, high quality software engineering organizations, whether it's Facebook or Amazon or Google or whatever. They come back and inject that into the local ecosystem, and that starts cascading down in terms of like quality and also sense of ambition. So yes, massive surge for Vietnam going forward. The other countries won't stand still, so I'm not saying that they'll necessarily overtake it, but frankly, that's irrelevant.
Okay. From Hussein, how has the COVID pandemic, so this one, COVID pandemic affected the quantity and quality of new startups and startup founders in ID and Vietnam, respectively. This one, I think, Peter, you mentioned earlier the opportunity cost, and I think a lot of founders kind of jumping in because the opportunity cost right now is actually lower. Has this actually played out to be true, in your opinion, Tessa, and how?
Do you want to take that first, Hao?
Yeah, sure. So I think it's a little bit too early to say, maybe, and maybe I'm not like so 100% focused on eyes and ears on the ground and hearing what's going on. But I would say that Vietnam historically, and probably the same for Indonesia, has always been a great place to incubate new startup founders because opportunity cost is low. I think if you're, like even for me, when I was working here, I moved to Vietnam to work for a company. My salary wasn't that high. And so for me to think like, oh, I could just leave and do something else is like easy for me to comprehend. It's not like the opportunity cost might be more related to like learning or self-development, more or less, but in regards to compensation or financial, it's never been an issue. I think in the last few months, actually not really. I think there's a lot of like Shopee, for example, it's on such a tear and they are hiring like mad and they are scooping up so much talent at the moment because I think the disparity between what they can pay and what startups can pay is just so high. Mm-hmm. And you could even say the same for companies like Tiki, TikTok. TikTok is hiring a ton of people. They almost hired one of ours, but we managed to not let that happen. But I think when it comes to new startups, again, too early to say. I actually haven't heard of too many literally starting like in the last few months. Yeah.
All right, Tessa?
Yeah, I'd have to agree. I haven't heard many popping up at the moment right this minute, but I just want to say like a bit of an observation about Indonesians. I think we're inherently very entrepreneurial. I think it's because the way the country is set up, right? For a lot of us, if you look on the street, people selling food and whatever else. If you look at people at home, a lot of my family members have side gigs, side hustles, right? Selling everything and anything on Instagram. My friends starting up, selling chili sauces online, right? In general, I think we're pretty adventurous. We're used to a lot of uncertainty. So I'm not sure that COVID would be stopping us from starting something new. Now, in terms of their ability to get off the ground and get the funding that they need, that's probably a whole other matter. But I don't think I've seen a lot of change in people saying, oh, maybe I shouldn't do something now because there's COVID, or perhaps the other way around.
Awesome. Okay, so we are just over time and we will end the Q&A session there. So thank you to all of our panelists for your insights today, and I think helping to compare and contrast the two different startup ecosystems in Vietnam and Indonesia. It's definitely not an easy topic to tackle within an hour, and I feel like we probably I know we miss like 98% of the content here, but thanks for attempting to try with us. And especially obviously thanks to Hao and the team at Vietcetera. So if anybody who's on wants to learn more about the themes and topics we touched today, I would encourage you to check out the TIA virtual conference that's going to happen this October. Any of our core and live subscribers can attend it at no additional cost, so you can just log in and RSVP for free right now. And of course, always check out vietcetera.com to stay on top of what is happening in Vietnam. Also, if you liked this session, hated this session, or have ideas for topics, fill it in our evaluation form and we'll certainly keep it in mind for next time. All right, thank you, panelists. Hope to see
Thank
you
you,
all
Maria.
in person
Maria.
soon.
Thank you so
For
much.
sure. Thanks for hosting.
Stay
Thank
safe,
you.
everyone.
Bye.
Thank you for hosting. Bye.